I want to go to Peter Schweizer, investigative journalist, of course, the president of the Government Accountability Institute, host of the Drill Down podcast. Mr. Schweizer, how are you, sir?
Hey, I'm good, Mike. Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful to talk to. Yeah, so let's, can we start with, actually, the reason we asked you on was to talk about China owning our farmland. Let's get to that, but let's start with Tim Walz, because we got the vice presidential debate tonight, 9 o'clock Eastern on CBS. And Breitbart has a story here. Walz's alleged ties to Chinese Communist Party deepen on the eve of the vice presidential debate with Vance. That was last night, now it's tonight. And we know, and at the very least, it was like this weird thing that he's been to China so many times and went to China on his honeymoon. That's weird. And like his anniversary was on Tiananmen Square anniversary, like on purpose. But that's like just the beginning. So what do we need to know about Tim Walz and China?
Yeah, I mean, look, you could say, okay, maybe the guy just kind of has a interest in China, an obsession with China. It doesn't mean anything more than that. The problem is when you start to peel back the onion, so to speak, and look at the relationship with China, it's a lot more, I think, troubling and intriguing than Walz's version of it. To give you one example, he had this exchange program where he would take students to China. And in his congressional races, when he ran for Congress, he presented this as a Harvard-funded program to bring Americans to China, cultural exchange, all of that. The problem is that's not actually true. It was not Harvard-funded. It was not Harvard-sanctioned. There were 2 Harvard graduates who had been involved in the exchange program, but the actual funding, the payment of the American students to go to China was actually paid for by the Chinese government. And then the question, of course, becomes, first of all, why wasn't he being clear on who was funding these trips? And why would the Chinese government want to fund these trips? And when you look at kind of the sorts of things he instructed students in, it becomes very clear that, maybe he's not a Maoist. I'm not saying that, but he clearly seemed to, at least at the time, have a soft spot for Beijing. This is right after the Tiananmen Square massacre. But according to the local media accounts at the time in the Midwest from students who went on his trips, he was telling students, downplay your Americanness when you're in China, which is an odd thing to say, given that it's a cultural exchange. I mean, you wouldn't want to tell Chinese students, come to the United States, downplay your Chineseness. And then he would say things, Mike, like, things in China are different. There's no poverty, which of course is utterly not true. He said there's no poverty because in China, unlike the United States, people share. So he had this kind of weird approach to teaching and explaining China to American students that fits very closely with China's strategy of getting influence and frankly, using exchange programs for propaganda.
I don't think any of this needs to be brought up today. We got 90 minutes to make the case against Kamala. I don't know if Walz's ties to China make the cut. They should, but not based off the audience they're talking to. That's why we're talking about it on Breitbart. But anyway, but it is on Breitbart. And there's this, have you checked out this whistleblower that was sent to Comer about Homeland Security having concerns about Walz's ties even to the Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah, no, again, look, I mean, there are lots of unanswered questions here. And clearly the strategy that the Harris-Walz campaign has adopted has been to just ignore press queries. And the press doesn't seem to be aggressive as you would expect in trying to answer questions. So, yeah, I mean, think about this. Walz, takes these trips to China 30 times. He's doing that, by the way, while he is in the U.S. Army Reserve. And he's an officer in the U.S. Army Reserve, and he has actually a security clearance. China at that time, China to this day, if you're in that position that Walz was in, you presumably have to get approval from officials to visit a country that is, deemed at a minimum a rival country. His campaign has been asked, the Minnesota National Guard has been asked by Breitbart reporters and others, did he actually ask for that approval? And there's no response. There's no evidence that he did. Now, maybe he did. But again, there would be serious questions asked. He comes back after, say, 15 times and says, I want to go back to China again. These are the absolute sort of things that you are in the military, you have a security clearance, that is a red flag. Travel to these countries, repeated travel to these countries. And the work that Comer's committee has been doing, I think, is shedding further light on some of the questions about, were those protocols followed? Were there concerns raised? Because we see that even when Walz became governor of Minnesota, he continued to have these sort of odd ties to what are called United Front groups. These are so-called cultural groups in the United States that are actually linked to the CCP, that do the bidding of the CCP. He has an unusually close relationship with those kinds of groups as well.
Yeah, what was it? It was the Minnesota mineral. It was like some government group in Minnesota.
There's several interesting ties here, Mike. One of them is
I love how you know where I'm going. I love how I say Minnesota Minerals, and you're like, oh yes, yes. Continue.
There's a couple of interesting ties there. One of them involves the Minnesota Investment Board. So this is the board that Walz is chairman of because he's governor, and this invests Minnesota's pension funds around the world, for teachers and firefighters and that sort of thing. And Minnesota has done something completely different than pretty much any other state since 2018. Since 2018, the state pension funds have either put a massive pause on any further investments in China, because there's all this reporting about how Chinese companies are helping the Chinese military-industrial complex. We're competing with them, et cetera. They're stealing technology. So even states like California, CalPERS, their retirement system, has really dramatically slowed down their investments in California. And some states like Texas and Florida have actually curtailed investments in Minnesota. In China. Minnesota is the outlier. Minnesota, since 2018, when Walz became governor, has actually increased by more than $1 billion its investments in Chinese companies, which is, again, very, very odd in the sense that it's out of character with everything else. So that's the first tie that I think is interesting. The second one, Mike, is that there are these, police stations, these Chinese police stations that have been scrutinized in the press. And these are basically run by these Chinese cultural organizations. They work with the Chinese Ministry of State Security, and their job is to keep a check on Chinese living in the United States, U.S. citizens, Chinese U.S. citizens living this, and making sure they're not critical of the CCP. And there have been instances of people being beaten up. There have been kidnappings, abductions, et cetera. There are known to be 5 of these police stations. One of them is in the Twin Cities, where, of course, Governor Walz is the governor. And curiously, he has not said or done anything about it. And in fact, the organization that runs this police station is linked to a entity called Minnesota Global that Walz is very close to. And so there's this odd question of, he certainly has been critical of the Minneapolis and Twin Cities police departments for their conduct, whether it was in 2020 or elsewhere. But he has said nothing about these Chinese police stations, and he has done nothing about it. In other states, like in Houston, Texas, for example, these police stations have been shut down by local authorities. So there are all these odd questions as to why he seems to have a soft spot for China.
Last point on Tim Walz, and we'll branch out. I saw a picture of, it was like the commissioner of the Minnesota's mineral rights group, whatever. And it was inside her summer cabin on some lake house cabin.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's like just straight Chinese propaganda on the wall. Like, here's a picture of Mao and like some other propaganda. It's like, what? Who on earth would have that up in their cabin? And anyway, the reason I brought that up, because that came out right when former governor of New York, Cuomo, and the current governor, Hochul, came out that one of their top aides was a straight up Chinese spy.
Yeah.
And you studied this way more than I have, and way more than most people who are just doing their job, of how prevalent Chinese spies are at high levels of government and the influence that they have. And like that, so that those sort of both came out at the same time. So it's not crazy to believe that there are people working for the Chinese government in high levels of even state government.
Oh yeah, I mean they have a strategy in this. They call it subnational operations. What they mean is, of course, that you want to go to Washington D.C. There's lots of important decisions that are made in Washington D.C., but there's also a lot of important decisions made at the state level. They've been very aggressive in California. I've written about that in my book Blood Money, talking about Governor Gavin Newsom and all the people around him that have these very, very sketchy ties, not only to the CCP, but to Chinese organized crime. And in the case of Minnesota, yes, you have this a woman that was appointed by Walz, who's responsible for the program for minerals, for developing minerals that would make us less dependent, ostensibly, on China and foreign countries. And she has this sort of love affair with China, with particularly Maoist-era China. She had Maoist propaganda on her wall. She had a big portrait of Che Guevara. And this, I think, is really interesting because, we've talked about the Bidens before, and, we were the first ones to break the story about the money that the Bidens got from the Chinese. In the case of Walz, there's no evidence that he's received money, but it seems as if he's kind of what they used to call a fellow traveler. He's a guy who says, gee, the Chinese communists are trying to do some good stuff here, and maybe they get a little bit too aggressive sometimes, but I really believe in what they're doing. And so it's this sort of ideological fascination. And you see it, not only with Walz, not only with this woman with the Minerals Board, one of his appointees to the Minnesota Education Department, who's responsible for the state curriculum, has declared that, America basically needs to be overthrown and reconstituted. So, this ideological affinity, it's not just people who are on the take financially who are getting money. It's people who really have a soft spot for these terrible ideas. Let's remember the Maoists killed 60 million of their own people. That's what this system is capable of, and Walz and others just make excuses for it.